Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where the sun scorches golden sands, and the Nile winds through the heart of an ancient civilization that built monuments reaching for the sky. Imagine yourself walking along the riverbanks, the water shimmering under the heat, papyrus rustling in the wind, and the scent of baked bread mingling with incense drifting from a distant temple. Palaces rise above mud brick homes, and in the bustling marketplaces, you can hear the shouts of vendors selling dates, figs, and salted fish. You probably won't survive this journey without occasionally tripping over the sheer magnitude of history under your feet. Giant statues of gods, hieroglyphs etched with obsessive care, and tombs that whisper secrets of kings long gone. It's grand, chaotic, and utterly mesmerizing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. It's fascinating to see how people around the world tune into this same dusty, sun-baked adventure. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your eyes follow the movement along the river. Boats gliding lazily carry farmers and fishermen, their nets dripping with the day's catch. You notice the fields stretching along the Nile, irrigated with ingenious channels that the people called shadoufs, raising water from the river into canals to nourish the crops. This river is both giver and taker. Its annual flood brings life, but also has the power to destroy. Egyptian civilization could not have existed without it. Yet the same waters are a constant reminder of nature's volatility. Historians still argue whether the Nile's predictability was the key to Egypt's stability, or whether it concealed vulnerabilities that would later accelerate its downfall. Ahead, you glimpse the first glimpses of monumental architecture. Mud brick walls topped with limestone, and towering obelisks catching the sunlight. Each stone seems to hum with the energy of laborers who hauled them into place, some of whom might have been conscripted, others hired, but all moving in a rhythm dictated by the sun and the river. You smell the mixture of mud, stone dust, and incense, a heady combination that reminds you just how much life, sweat, and ritual were intertwined. The work isn't glamorous. Imagine lifting blocks heavier than yourself, while overseers shout instructions and the priests chant prayers, invoking protection from gods who watch over both the workers and their rulers. And speaking of rulers, there's the ever-present aura of the Pharaohs. These aren't mere kings, they are gods incarnate on earth. People bow, offer gifts, and whisper prayers to statues whose eyes seem alive. You feel the weight of authority pressing down on everything. Markets, temples, and even the river itself. Historians still argue whether the divine aura of the pharaoh was a tool of control or a genuine belief system that shaped every aspect of Egyptian life. You notice scribes recording transactions, artisans carving hieroglyphs, and children weaving in the marketplaces, a tapestry of lives all orbiting the central figure of God-King authority. The streets carry sounds too. The rhythmic clatter of pottery, the squawk of birds being sold for dinner, and the occasional splash of water as fishmongers toss their catch into tubs. You're struck by contrasts, the opulence of temple offerings and the scarcity of commoners' meals. The divine rituals unfolding in elaborate temples versus the simple, human joys of bread and figs. In one courtyard, someone is preparing beer, the staple drink of both peasants and nobles alike, and its sweet, yeasty aroma wafts into the marketplace. Even beverages carried weight in society, and beer here is not just sustenance, it's culture, community, and, at times, a political tool. Take a moment to notice the quirks. Priests using crocodile dung as sunscreen, pharaohs commissioning monuments that no single human could lift alone, and festivals that blur the line between devotion and indulgence. Egypt is strange, beautiful, and at times contradictory. It's a civilization standing on genius and hubris alike. And as you move along the Nile, the river's gentle ripple under your feet contrasts the towering ambitions around you, whispering promises and warnings alike. The fall of the Pharaohs, though centuries away, is already in the soil and the water, waiting to unfold. The river still murmurs beside you, but tonight your eyes shift from the broad sweep of monuments to the lifeblood that made them possible, the Nile itself. You hear the slap of water against the wooden hull of a fisherman's boat, and smell wet reeds baking in the afternoon sun. The Nile is generous. It feeds fields of wheat, barley, and flax, carrying silt rich enough to turn sand into bread. Yet, just like that friend who always shows up uninvited, the Nile sometimes gave more than anyone could handle. When the floods rose too high, entire villages were swallowed too low, and famine stalked the land with empty granaries. You tread carefully on muddy soil, realizing that Egypt's greatness and its fragility rested on this watery heartbeat. The Egyptians called the floods the inundation, and their calendar revolved around it. Priests stood on temple walls, observing water levels, while farmers sharpened their tools, ready for sowing once the waters receded. You imagine them waiting nervously, hoping the river would rise just enough but not too much. Historians still argue whether the Nile's steady rhythm was truly predictable or whether the occasional irregular floods planted the seeds of Egypt's political unrest centuries later. There's something almost magical about the rituals surrounding the river. Priests tossed offerings into the current, golden bowls, flowers, even miniature figurines pleading with the gods for balance. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some ancient texts mention ceremonies where young women were symbolically married to the Nile, as if the river itself needed a bride. Was this myth, metaphor, or a literal practice? The debate goes on, but the imagery sticks with you. A civilization so desperate for stability that it personified its river as a husband who needed pampering. Walking along its banks, you notice irrigation tools. The shadoof poles with counterweights swinging water into channels. The sound of buckets splashing as farmers hurry to keep their crops alive. Children laugh while chasing frogs in the shallows, blissfully unaware that their future depends on the delicate balance between drought and flood. The river nourishes not only bodies, but also the pharaoh's authority. Every harvest that succeeded confirmed divine favor. Every famine cracked the illusion of godlike power. You realize the Nile is both throne and noose, binding Egypt in prosperity and reminding it that all greatness floats precariously on water. Your steps echo now in the vast courtyards of temples, where carved walls shimmer with painted reliefs, and the scent of incense clings to your skin. Well, this is the domain of pharaohs, the so-called gods on earth. Imagine standing before a colossal statue where the ruler's face is frozen in stone. Serene, all-knowing, terrifying in its perfection. People kneel, hands outstretched, whispering prayers not just to deities like Ra or Osiris, but to the living king himself. The pharaoh isn't just a politician. He is divinity wrapped in linen, a bridge between gods and mortals. Talk about pressure. You thought a bad Monday at the office was tough. The aura of the pharaoh's power radiates everywhere. Farmers believe their crops thrive under his blessing. Soldiers swear loyalty not to a general but to this divine figure. And artisans etch every detail of his deeds into stone to ensure his eternal remembrance. It's intoxicating, but also fragile. One failed harvest, one lost battle, and suddenly whispers creep through the crowds. Maybe the God King isn't so divine after all. Historians still argue whether Egyptians truly believed in their pharaoh's divinity, or whether it was an elaborate social contract, an ancient PR stunt that kept society glued together. And the rituals, you watch priests carefully anoint statues of the pharaoh with scented oils. Treating stone as flesh, the king's regalia gleams, the crook and flail symbolizing care and punishment, the cobra crown ready to spit fire at enemies. A quirky tidbit. Some pharaohs staged elaborate Sed festivals to prove their vitality. Essentially ancient kingly fitness tests where rulers, sometimes well into their 70s, jogged laps in ceremonial courtyards to show they were still strong enough to rule. Imagine your grandpa doing laps to keep the throne. That's dedication, or maybe denial. As you trace hieroglyphs along cool limestone walls, you realize the entire society orbits this one figure. The pharaoh's smile is eternal, his power absolute, and yet, deep down, you sense the vulnerability. Power that depends on being seen as a god can crumble the moment people stop believing. And in that faint crack of doubt lies the beginning of Egypt's long unraveling. Your sandals crunch on gravel as you step closer to a construction site that feels less like work and more like a cosmic performance. Dust swirls in the sunlight, workers chant in rhythm, and the earth itself seems to groan under the weight of ambition. You're standing at the base of a monument in progress, an obelisk, half carved from the quarry rock, its massive length waiting to be freed. The noise is overwhelming. Copper chisels ping against stone, ropes creak, overseers bark instructions. It's not glamorous, it's blistered hands, aching backs, and the constant threat of a block shifting the wrong way. The Egyptians believed that building monuments wasn't just a civic duty. It was sacred work, offerings to gods and eternal testaments to a pharaoh's glory. Each temple, pyramid, or obelisk declared, "I was here, and I mattered," a mainstream fact. These projects employed tens of thousands of workers, not just slaves, but also seasonal laborers drafted from villages, fed and housed in massive workers' camps. Imagine your local neighborhood suddenly being told, "Congrats, you're now part of a 20-year pyramid project." Not exactly an ideal summer job. Here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists discovered the unfinished obelisk at Aswan, abandoned because a giant crack ruined the stone. It lies there, still attached to the quarry floor. A monument to failure as much as ambition. You can almost hear the groans of workers who realized months, maybe years of effort had literally cracked in two. Talk about a workplace nightmare. And yet, these constructions were more than vanity. They created jobs, redistributed food, and reinforced the pharaoh's divine aura. Every stone hauled upward reminded the people who was in charge. Historians still argue whether these colossal projects drained Egypt's economy or actually stabilized it by keeping idle hands busy and bellies fed. You walk beneath a towering wall, hieroglyphs fresh with color, and feel both awe and exhaustion. The stones promise eternity, but you can sense the hidden cost, an empire weighed down by its own monuments. You wander past the roar of chisels and into a quieter, shadowy hall where the air is thick with incense and whispers. This is the realm of priests, keepers of secrets, masters of ritual, and sometimes manipulators of power. Their shaved heads gleam in the torchlight as they murmur spells, their linen robes rustling like dry reeds. You catch the flicker of oil lamps illuminating walls painted with gods, falcon-headed Horus, jackal-headed Anubis, and the ever-watchful Rai. The atmosphere hums with something otherworldly, as if the air itself is listening. Priests weren't just spiritual leaders, they were scientists, administrators, and healers rolled into one. They observed stars to mark the calendar, calculated taxes from harvest yields, and wrote medical remedies mixing herbs with chants. A mainstream fact, temples like Karnak weren't only sacred spaces, they were economic powerhouses, owning land, granaries, and workshops. The priesthood wielded influence that sometimes rivaled the pharaoh's authority. You realize this wasn't just religion? It was politics draped in incense smoke. And here's your quirky tidbit of the night. Ancient Egyptians sometimes wore amulets shaped like onions to ward off evil spirits. Imagine walking into a temple, nervously clutching your onion necklace, hoping no demon takes you seriously. Not exactly Prada, but hey, protection is protection. Historians still argue whether the priests were truly devout believers or pragmatic power brokers cloaked in ritual. Were their elaborate ceremonies genuine acts of faith? Or were they carefully crafted theater designed to keep the populace obedient and the pharaoh dependent? As you stand in the half-light, you notice how every gesture is ritualized, pouring libations, burning incense, ringing bells. The crowd believes, the priests perform, and the cycle of awe continues. You feel both enchanted and uneasy, sensing that Egypt's strength lies not only in stone and soldiers, but in the intangible power of belief and the men who controlled it. The incense fades as you step out into the sunlight again, and suddenly the grandeur of temples feels distant. What surrounds you now is the heartbeat of Egypt, the daily lives of common people. Mud brick houses huddle close together, their walls patched with straw and clay. Smoke curls from cooking fires, and the aroma of lentil stew mingles with the sharper tang of fish drying in the sun. Chickens scatter underfoot, goats bleat, and children run barefoot through the dust, their laughter weaving through the hum of ordinary survival. A mainstream fact. Most Egyptians were farmers, tied directly to the rhythm of the Nile. Their days revolved around planting, harvesting, and paying grain taxes that filled the pharaoh's granaries. Life was hard work with little glamour, yet it sustained the mighty pyramids and temples we admire today. Without these countless laborers, the god-kings would have had no throne to stand on. But daily life had its quirky sides too. For example, lice were such a constant annoyance that many Egyptians shaved their heads and wore wigs. Not for style, but for hygiene. Imagine taking off your fancy braided wig at night, sighing in relief, and thinking, at least no creepy crawlies tonight. A very different kind of bedtime routine. Historians still argue whether commoners truly believed in the divine nature of their rulers, or if loyalty was more a matter of survival. Did farmers pray sincerely for the pharaoh's favor, or did they bow out of fear of tax collectors and soldiers? The evidence is scattered. Songs of devotion etched into tomb walls alongside graffiti scrawled by workers complaining about their rations. You sit with a family in their courtyard. They pass around bread made from emmer wheat, dipping it in oil, while the father tells stories of gods and ancestors. The food is simple, but there's warmth in the way they share it. You realize Egypt wasn't just towering monuments, it was these small, human moments of laughter, complaints, and resilience. The grandeur of pharaohs may rise and fall, but the people's lives carry on, stitching history together one loaf of bread at a time. The hum of everyday life shifts as you notice something unusual. Women moving with authority, their voices rising above the marketplace chatter. Egypt, unlike many ancient cultures, carved out spaces for women that could stretch far beyond the household. Queens, priestesses, and even businesswomen shaped society in ways both subtle and bold. You watch a woman tallying grain accounts on a papyrus scroll, while another negotiates in the market with the confidence of someone who knows the value of every copper diban in her purse. A mainstream fact. Egyptian women could own property, initiate divorce, and run businesses. Rights far beyond what many later societies allowed. It wasn't perfect equality, but it was remarkable compared to the restrictions women faced elsewhere in the ancient world. In tomb paintings, you often see husbands and wives seated side by side, a symbolic gesture of partnership that reflected real social dynamics. But then there were the queens. Oh, the queens. They weren't content to stay in the shadows. Hatshepsut donned the pharaoh's crown. Cleopatra bent empires to her will, and Nefertiti's face became iconic. Even lesser-known royal women played power games behind the throne. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some queens were buried with beards carved onto their statues, a literal attempt to embody the male imagery of kingship. Imagine trying on a fake beard just to say, "Yes, I'm in charge now." Historians still argue whether these women's power was symbolic, propped up by circumstances, or if they genuinely commanded authority on their own. Were they true rulers, or placeholders until a male heir stepped up? The debate lingers, but you can feel the strength of their presence. As you listen to the marketplace gossip, you hear names whispered with both respect and fear. You realize Egypt's fall wasn't just the story of pharaohs, it was also the story of women navigating power, bending traditions, and leaving marks that still echo millennia later. The marketplace noise fades into chanting once again, and your steps carry you toward a shadowed temple where every wall is painted with images of gods, stars, and the endless passage to the afterlife. Egyptians were obsessed, utterly, magnificently obsessed, with what came after death. You see mourners carrying jars of food, linen bundles, and even tiny figurines called ushapti, meant to serve the deceased in eternity. The air smells of resin and myrrh, sweet and pungent, clinging to your nose as if reminding you that death is never far away here. A mainstream fact: Egyptians devoted staggering resources to tombs, coffins, and burial goods because they believed life after death was simply a continuation of this one, provided you played by the cosmic rules. Tomb paintings show banquets, music, and fertile fields waiting beyond the veil, all sustained by elaborate rituals performed by priests and family members. But then there's the quirky side. Some spells in the Book of the Dead instructed the deceased to declare, "I have not stolen bread, I have not lied, I have not killed." Imagine your eternal fate depending on a cosmic checklist, like an ancient lie detector test before Osiris and his feather of truth. Forget forgetting to floss. Forgetting the right spell could mean eternal doom. Historians still argue whether all this afterlife obsession reflected deep personal faith, or if it was mostly about displaying social status. Were tombs really about securing eternity, or were they ways for the elite to show off wealth even after death? As you run your hand along a carved doorway, you realize the grandeur and fragility of it all. Every offering, every spell, every painted feather was a hedge against oblivion. You sense the irony. While the pyramids still loom, the lives of countless ordinary Egyptians, who also longed for eternity, vanished like footprints in the sand. You leave the tomb's incense-laden silence and step into the clash of metal and the thud of marching boots. Egypt wasn't just about priests and farmers, it was also an empire defended and expanded by military might. Dust clouds swirl as soldiers train in the blazing sun, their shields catching the light, their spears forming a forest of bronze points. You hear the bark of a commander, the grunt of men moving in formation, and you realize that behind every serene temple wall was the constant readiness for war. A mainstream fact: Egypt's armies weren't only defensive, they launched campaigns into Nubia, Canaan, and even clashed with the mighty Hittites. Ramses II's battle at Kadesh remains one of the most famous military encounters of the ancient world. Complete with chariots thundering across the battlefield, soldiers weren't faceless either. They were often peasants conscripted during flood season, fighting for rations, loot, and the favor of the pharaoh. Here's a quirky tidbit. Egyptian soldiers carried throwing sticks, curved wooden weapons that looked suspiciously like early boomerangs. Imagine hurling one in battle, praying it hits the enemy and not your buddy chewing dates behind you. Functional, but also a little comedic when you picture it spinning through the desert air. Historians still argue whether Egypt's military strength was truly decisive or more symbolic. Some say their armies were unstoppable chariot masters, while others point out that Egypt relied heavily on mercenaries, Libyans, Nubians, and even Greek warriors in later centuries. As you watch men practice maneuvers, sweat dripping down their backs, you realize the paradox? Egypt's grandeur depended not just on temples and crops, but on the muscle of men who risked everything in foreign deserts. And while their victories carved glory into stone, their defeats carved cracks into the pharaoh's divine armor. Your ears are still ringing from the clash of shields when a new sound drifts through the air. bells jingling from camel harnesses, the chatter of merchants haggling in half a dozen languages, and the creak of wooden carts piled high with exotic goods. Egypt was never an island. It thrived on trade, its wealth swelling with every shipment of incense, copper, and timber drifting down the Nile or arriving through dusty caravan routes. You weave through a market thrumming with activity, colors flashing from dyed cloth, baskets brimming with spices, and the gleam of imported lapis lazuli, a mainstream fact. Trade was essential to Egypt's prosperity. From the Levant came cedar wood, from Nubia golden ivory, and from Punt, the mysterious land of the gods, frankincense and myrrh. These weren't just luxuries, they were political tools. A pharaoh's ability to secure exotic goods signaled power and control, reinforcing his divine aura. Even the temples demanded imports, incense for rituals, metals for statues, and fine linen for wrapping the dead. Here's your quirky tidbit. Ancient Egyptians prized cinnamon, but historians still argue whether it came from as far away as Sri Lanka, or if it was actually a substitute spice passed off as the real thing. Imagine paying a fortune for your authentic imported cinnamon, only to find out it's just the ancient equivalent of knockoff brand cereal. Historians still argue whether Egypt's reliance on foreign goods ultimately weakened it. Did the hunger for luxuries drain resources and make the state dependent on fragile trade networks? Or did these connections strengthen Egypt by weaving it into a larger web of power and wealth? As you finger a piece of polished turquoise at a merchant's stall, you realize both possibilities could be true. Egypt's glory glittered in imported jewels and perfumed oils, but every caravan and ship also tied its fate to distant lands and unpredictable allies. The empire was mighty, yes, but also vulnerable, balanced precariously on the wheels of trade carts rolling across the desert. The market's perfume of spices fades as you wander deeper into the alleys, where life feels a little less glamorous and a lot more raw. Behind the facade of golden obelisks and perfumed temples lies the machinery that kept Egypt running. Slavery and servitude. You pass rows of workers bent over baskets, carrying bricks, grinding grain, or hauling jars of water under the merciless sun. Their backs glisten with sweat, their hands are cracked, and their eyes dart nervously when an overseer shouts. A mainstream fact. Contrary to Hollywood cliches, the pyramids weren't built solely by slaves. Most labor came from conscripted peasants working during the flood season. But make no mistake, slavery existed in Egypt, especially after military campaigns. Prisoners of war from Nubia, Libya, and the Near East were brought back as slaves, often forced into labor or service in elite households. Their lives were precarious, entirely at the mercy of masters who saw them as property. Now for the quirky detail. In some cases, wealthy Egyptians were buried with small servant figurines called ushabti, magically expected to spring to life in the afterlife and do chores for them. Imagine thinking, well, I can't bring Steve my servant into the afterlife, but this little clay doll will do just fine. A macabre mix of practicality and wishful thinking. Historians still argue about the scale and severity of Egyptian slavery. Was it central to the economy? Or was it a secondary system compared to peasant labor? The evidence is fragmentary: contracts, tomb paintings, and legal records that sometimes contradict each other. As you watch workers trudging past, some bound by circumstance, others by chains, you feel the weight of inequality. Egypt's glittering monuments, its golden masks, and its sumptuous feasts rested on shoulders that rarely shared in the glory. And you realize the cracks in the empire's foundation weren't just in the stone. They were in the human cost of keeping that grandeur alive. The shuffle of laborers fades into a new sound. The creak of granary doors and the clink of copper scales weighing out grain. Egypt's fortunes rose and fell on its economy, and you can feel the pulse of wealth and hunger in the air. On good years, the Nile's floods blessed the fields, and the granaries overflowed. Priests and scribes proudly recorded bountiful harvests, Taxes rolled in, and the temples glittered with offerings. But lean years, that's when whispers of famine echoed through mud brick homes. And people lined up, desperate for bread. A mainstream fact, Egypt's economy was largely agrarian, built on the cultivation of wheat and barley, with surpluses funneled into massive state projects. Pharaohs used this wealth to finance armies, temples, and international trade, ensuring their status as both provider and protector. But the system was fragile. One failed flood could send the whole structure teetering. And here's your quirky tidbit. During particularly desperate famines, ancient texts mention families resorting to eating reed bread, a concoction of ground-up plants mixed with scraps of flour. Imagine biting into what is essentially flavored cardboard, telling yourself, ah yes, this is living. It wasn't exactly a gourmet solution, but it shows just how creative survival could get. Historians still argue whether the economy collapsed under its own weight or was undone by external shocks. Climate change, invasions, or mismanagement. Was Egypt's downfall baked into its over-reliance on a single river? Or could better governance have saved it? You can feel the tension as scribes tally numbers in the granary, trying to mask shortages with neat columns of ink. For a moment, you catch the worried glance of a farmer whose basket is half empty, his family's fate hanging on the unpredictable flood. The empire looks eternal on its monuments. But in the marketplace, the truth is clear. Prosperity and collapse are separated by only a thin layer of silt. The sound of grain doors slamming gives way to something heavier. Rumors of collapsing kingdoms and whispers of chaos spreading across the Mediterranean world. You can almost feel the air tense, as if Egypt itself holds its breath. This is the late Bronze Age collapse, a storm of invasions, climate shifts, and political breakdowns that rippled through every corner of the ancient world. Egypt, mighty and proud, was no exception, a mainstream fact. Around the 12th century BCE, civilizations from Greece to Anatolia fell into ruin. Great powers like the Hittites and Mycenaeans crumbled, trade routes disintegrated, and Egypt faced wave after wave of external threats. In temple reliefs, pharaohs boast of victories against the mysterious sea peoples, groups of raiders who attacked Egypt's coast with ships and fire. Ramses III carved into stone his triumphs over them. Yet behind the propaganda lurks the truth. These invasions nearly snapped Egypt's spine. And here's a quirky tidbit. One record claims the sea peoples brought their families, wives, children, even oxen in their wagons, as if invading Egypt were just a road trip with the in-laws. Picture storming a mighty empire while your toddler tugs at your tunic asking for snacks. Not exactly the fearsome image the reliefs suggest, but it shows the scale of migration, not just warfare. Historians still argue whether climate change, droughts, and famine triggered this collapse, or if it was simply a domino effect of failing empires. Was Egypt resilient because of the Nile's gifts, or did the river only delay the inevitable? You sense the uncertainty in the voices of priests promising divine protection, while generals drill exhausted soldiers at the borders. The mighty monuments still tower, but cracks are spreading, political, environmental, and human. As you watch smoke curl into the sky from a distant raid, you realize Egypt's story is no longer one of eternal stability. It has entered an age of survival. The smoke from raiders drifts behind you as you step into a courtyard alive with whispers about a pharaoh unlike any other, Hatshepsut. She isn't hidden behind a husband or son. She stands at the very center of power. A woman who dared to wear the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. You picture her processions, incense curling from golden barges as she sails to the great temple at Deir el-Bahari, its terraces gleaming against the cliffs like a staircase to the heavens. A mainstream fact. Hatshepsut ruled in the 15th century BCE and is remembered as one of Egypt's most successful pharaohs. She focused less on endless warfare and more on prosperity. expanding trade with Punt and overseeing ambitious building projects. Under her reign, Egypt thrived, and her temple still stands as one of the most beautiful architectural achievements of the ancient world. And here's a quirky tidbit. Hatshepsut often depicted herself with a false beard and statues, adopting male regalia to fit the image of kingship. Imagine the royal makeup session: crown, check; kilt, check; beard, don't forget the beard. It was both practical and symbolic, a way of bending tradition without breaking it. Historians still argue whether her reign was a golden age cut tragically short, or an uneasy experiment that angered conservative factions. Did she rule in harmony with her stepson Thutmose III, or was there quiet tension simmering under the surface? Later, pharaohs tried to erase her name from monuments, chiseling away her legacy, yet here you stand, watching her obelisks pierce the sky, a reminder that her presence was too powerful to vanish completely. You realize Egypt's story isn't just about decline. It's about bold experiments, ambitious rulers, and the fragile line between glory and erasure. The terraces of Hatshepsut's temple fade into dust as you wander deeper into history. And suddenly the air feels heavier, almost suffocating. Whispers swirl of a pharaoh who dared to do the unthinkable. Akhenaten, he's not interested in simply tweaking tradition. He rips the very foundation of Egyptian religion apart. Instead of honoring a pantheon of gods, he demands worship of just one, Aten, the sun disk. You feel the heat of the blazing orb above, no longer a symbol among many, but the single focus of devotion, a mainstream fact. Akhenaten, who reigned in the 14th century BCE, initiated one of history's first known experiments with monotheism. He moved the capital to a new city, Akhenaten Modern Amarna, and filled it with open-air temples dedicated to Aten. Statues of other gods were smashed, temples closed, and traditional priesthoods sidelined. The old religious order seethed, but Akhenaten pressed forward, reshaping art, worship, and politics to reflect his radical vision. Now for the quirky tidbit. In the new art style of Amarna, Akhenaten and his queen, Nefertiti, are shown with elongated heads, spindly limbs, and potbellies. Some scholars suggest it was symbolic of divine uniqueness. Others wonder if it reflected a medical condition. And a few joke it looks like ancient Egypt's brief flirtation with abstract cubism. Imagine your royal portrait session ending with, "Don't worry, everyone will love your noodle arms." Historians still argue whether Akhenaten was a visionary ahead of his time, a tyrant dismantling Egypt's traditions, or simply a ruler obsessed with his own brand of theology. Did his revolution enrich spiritual life? Or did it destabilize the empire at a time it could least afford it? The evidence lies in broken temples and hurried attempts to erase his memory. You step through the ruins of Amarna, wind-whipping sand against your face, and feel the tension between devotion and rebellion. Egypt's foundations tremble, not from flood or invasion this time, but from the radical dreams of one man determined to reshape eternity itself. The wind still stings your face as you leave the ruins of Akhenaten, but ahead the desert softens, and whispers of a boy king drift through the air. Tutankhamun. The name alone sparks curiosity, thanks to his golden burial mask glimmering in modern museums. But his short reign in the 14th century BCE was far from golden. You picture a young teenager, barely more than a child, suddenly carrying the burden of a fractured empire and a furious priesthood, desperate to restore the old gods. A mainstream fact: Tutankhamun became pharaoh around age 9 and ruled for only about a decade before his early death. Likely around 18 or 19, his reign was pivotal not because of his accomplishments, there were few, but because he reversed Akhenaten's radical monotheism. Temples of Amun reopened, the capital returned to Thebes, and traditional art and rituals surged back. Essentially, the Boy King was a reset button for Egypt's cosmic order. Here's a quirky tidbit. Inside his tomb, Archaeologists found a dagger made from meteoric iron, literally forged from a piece of space rock. Imagine telling your friends, "My sword's cool, but my king's dagger, yeah, it fell from the sky." Tutankhamun might have been fragile in body, but he was still armed with cosmic bling. Historians still argue about the cause of his death. Was it illness, a genetic disorder, an accident, or even foul play from ambitious courtiers? CT scans and DNA tests have fueled endless debates, but the truth remains elusive. As you picture the boy king limping through his palace, likely plagued with health problems, you sense both tragedy and symbolism. Egypt, too, was limping, trying to heal from the chaos of Akhenaten's revolution. And while Tutankhamun may not have been a mighty conqueror, his tomb's untouched treasures became an immortal reminder that even the frailest pharaoh could leave a thunderous echo across time. The golden shimmer of Tutankhamun's treasures fades, but ahead you see colossal stone statues towering like sentinels. Ramses II. His legacy looms so large it almost feels like he's still alive, watching you from every temple, every carved inscription, every colossal monument screaming, "Remember me." The man wasn't subtle. Known as Ramses the Great, he ruled for over 6 decades in the 13th century BCE, leaving behind more statues of himself than any other pharaoh dared to commission. You walk beneath the gaze of a 20-meter-high colossus, the stone smile unnerving in its calm assurance. A mainstream fact: Ramses II expanded Egypt's empire, fought the famous Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, and signed what is considered one of the world's earliest known peace treaties. His reign was marked by monumental construction projects, like the temples at Abu Simbel, cut directly into cliffs so that the rising sun would illuminate his image twice a year. Egypt under Ramses felt invincible, brimming with wealth, pride, and propaganda. And here's your quirky tidbit: Ramses loved leaving behind inscriptions claiming victory. But at Kadesh, the victory was more of a stalemate, yet he still plastered the walls with dramatic scenes of him smiting enemies single-handedly. Imagine failing your group project but still writing on the board, "I alone did all the work." The confidence is unmatched. Historians still argue whether Ramses II's reign was a true golden age or a high-budget illusion that masked economic strain. His grand monuments and sprawling family over 100 children, by some counts, created the image of eternal stability. But did his obsession with legacy also burden Egypt with debts and stretched resources? As you stand in the shadow of Abu Simbel, watching the sun crawl across stone lips carved millennia ago, you sense the duality: a man determined to be eternal, and a civilization that perhaps stretched itself too thin trying to keep up with his colossal ego. The colossal shadows of Ramses II sink into the desert twilight, and as you walk further, the air feels heavier, the colors dimmer. The glory of Egypt is still there. Temples still rise, statues still stare, the Nile still flows, but something is off. It's like listening to an orchestra that's missing half its instruments. This is the age of decline under the later dynasties, where cracks in the once unshakable facade begin to spread wider and wider. A mainstream fact: after Ramses II's death, Egypt entered a slow decline. Successive rulers lacked his charisma and resources, and internal divisions became harder to control. The power of the priesthood grew, often rivaling the authority of the pharaoh. Tomb robberies became rampant, so much so that later kings abandoned the Valley of the Kings and buried themselves in less conspicuous places. Imagine being the god on earth, but still worried your afterlife bling might get looted by your neighbor. Not exactly divine security. Here's a quirky tidbit. One papyrus record lists complaints from workmen who went on strike because they hadn't been paid their rations. Yes, the world's first recorded labor strike happened in Egypt. Picture tired masons crossing their arms, saying, "No bread, no work." It's oddly relatable even 3,000 years ago. People refused to build pyramids on an empty stomach. Historians still argue whether Egypt's decline was caused mainly by weak rulers or by external pressures like invasions and economic collapse. Was it rot from within or storms from without? The truth, as always, seems tangled. You walk through a half-finished temple, the columns still rising but the walls bare of decoration, and you sense the fatigue of a civilization where once ambition soared. Now pragmatism and perhaps despair takes over. The grandeur hasn't vanished, but it feels thinner, stretched, and more desperate, like paint flaking from stone. The fall of the Pharaohs isn't sudden, it's a long sigh, and you are now walking through its echo as you step away from the weary temples. The dust of Egypt's fading empire settles around you. The relentless desert winds sweep across the land, and you can almost feel the cracks in the earth. Echoes of the once mighty pharaohs now slipping through the fingers of history. Just as Egypt's monuments began to show signs of wear, so too did its defenses weaken under the weight of persistent invasions. You hear the clatter of foreign soldiers marching, the growl of enemies at the gates. Egypt's borders, once secure behind its river, are no longer impenetrable. A mainstream fact. In the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, Egypt fell prey to a series of invaders. First the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, and eventually the Persians. Each of these powers chipped away at Egypt's sovereignty, leaving the once proud civilization fragmented and vulnerable. The pharaoh's divine claims to the throne now seemed more like distant echoes. No longer the invincible conquerors, Egypt was now a prize to be seized. And here's your quirky tidbit. The Persian king Cambyses, upon conquering Egypt, famously marched into the sacred city of Thebes and raided the great temple of Amun. But after the plunder, he reportedly tried to change his luck by sacrificing a bull, only to find the animal, believed to be divinely favored, refused to die, making Cambyses' attempts at conquering the gods just a tad less successful. One can only imagine the awkward moment when your god's favorite bull decides it's just not feeling the sacrifice. Historians still debate how much Egypt's internal weakness contributed to these invasions versus the sheer force of external powers. Was Egypt's fall inevitable, or could stronger leadership have kept invaders at bay? The once great Egyptian military, now stretched thin by continuous struggles, could only fend off so much. As you walk past crumbling fortifications, you sense that Egypt wasn't simply overrun. It was exhausted. The gods and kings no longer seemed to protect. And in their absence, Egypt became just another kingdom for the taking. The foreign banners waving over Egypt's once proud cities mark a painful chapter. But the story isn't over yet. You stand at the crossroads of Egypt's imperial decline, watching as Persian rulers tighten their grip on the land. Yet, Egypt's ancient soul doesn't fade completely, it transforms, blending its culture with new rulers in ways that shape the future. The city of Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, becomes the epicenter of this new world, a melting pot of Greek and Egyptian traditions, a mainstream fact. After Alexander's death, Egypt fell under the rule of his general, Ptolemy, starting the Ptolemaic dynasty that would last for nearly 300 years. The Ptolemies embraced Egyptian culture and religion, even adopting the title of pharaoh, but they also brought Greek influences, creating a unique blend of Hellenistic and Egyptian art, science, and governance. Alexandria, with its grand library and the famous lighthouse, stood as a beacon of intellectual and cultural achievement, drawing scholars from across the ancient world. Here's your quirky tidbit. Cleopatra Sevede, the last Ptolemaic ruler, wasn't even ethnically Egyptian. She was of Macedonian descent, her family having come to Egypt with Alexander's generals. Yet, she learned to speak Egyptian and presented herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis, cleverly blending foreign and native identity to consolidate her power. She may have been Greek by blood, but her political genius made her Egyptian in the eyes of her people, Imagine the world's most famous queen navigating the complexities of political and cultural identity while fending off Romans. That's a royal multitasker. Historians still argue whether the Ptolemaic period revitalized Egypt or merely prolonged its decline. Some see it as a renaissance, a time when Egypt became a center of learning and innovation once more. Others see it as a hollow facade, an Egypt ruled by outsiders who merely used its resources to fund their wars and schemes. You stand before the grand ruins of the Library of Alexandria, once filled with scrolls that contained the wisdom of the ancient world, and realize how Egypt's fate was no longer in its own hands. The story of Egypt, both ancient and modern, is now one of shifting identities and a constant search for rebirth. The scrolls of Alexandria's library crumble to ash in your imagination, and from the smoke rises the figure of Cleopatra VII, the last great pharaoh, the woman who tried to hold Egypt's fate in her hands. You hear the rustle of silk, the clink of jewelry, and the low murmur of court intrigue. Cleopatra is not just a queen, she's a strategist, a diplomat, and a performer who knows her stage is nothing less than the entire Mediterranean. A mainstream fact: Cleopatra reigned during the 1st century BCE, at a time when Egypt had become a client kingdom of Rome. She was the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and her reign was marked by political alliances, especially her famous relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. Through charisma, cunning, and theatrical flair, she kept Egypt independent for a time, playing Rome's most powerful men against each other. Here's a quirky tidbit. According to legend, Cleopatra once bet Antony that she could throw the most expensive banquet in history. To prove it, she dissolved one of her priceless pearl earrings in vinegar and drank it. Was it chemistry or just a tall tale? Historians still argue whether the story is true or propaganda, but either way, it's one heck of a mic drop in a dinner party showdown. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra was primarily a patriot fighting for Egypt's survival, or a shrewd monarch pursuing her own dynasty's interests. Was she the embodiment of Isis protecting her people, or was she just the last player in a fading power struggle? As you follow her into candlelit chambers where maps of Rome and Egypt lie side by side, you feel the tension in every breath. Cleopatra is brilliant, magnetic, and fragile all at once. And through her, Egypt makes its final gamble, staking survival on wit, charm, and the dangerous game of Roman politics. The candlelight fades, and suddenly you're standing on a battlefield of whispers and steel. The legions of Rome march closer, their armor clinking in the desert heat, and Egypt braces for its final showdown. You hear the roll of drums, the clash of swords, and the strained voices of Egyptians who know they can no longer fight on equal terms. Rome is a juggernaut, and Egypt's independence hangs by a thread. A mainstream fact: after Julius Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra aligned herself with Mark Antony, one of Rome's most powerful generals. Their partnership was both political and romantic, a union meant to keep Egypt's sovereignty alive. But Octavian, later Augustus, rose as their rival. The infamous Battle of Actium in 31 BCE saw Antony and Cleopatra's fleets defeated, sealing Egypt's fate. Within a year, both Antony and Cleopatra were dead, and Egypt became a Roman province. The end of Pharaohs after 3,000 years of divine rule. Here's a quirky tidbit. Cleopatra's legendary death by snakebite might not have been so simple as some scholars suggest poison hidden in ointments or even a sharp hairpin laced with venom. Others think the snake story was Roman propaganda, a neat way to dramatize her end. Imagine the gossip mill. Did she really let a cobra loose in her chambers? Or was that just Octavian's PR team making her sound exotic? Historians still argue whether Cleopatra's downfall was inevitable, or if her gamble with Antony could have succeeded under different circumstances. Was it love, strategy, or desperation that bound them together? The debate lingers, but as you walk through the ruins of her palace, columns toppled, mosaics fading, you feel the gravity of the moment. Egypt, once a titan that dictated the fate of empires, now bows to Rome. The gods of the Nile fall silent, replaced by the eagle of a new empire. The fall of the pharaohs is complete, and the echoes of their voices scatter like sand in the wind. The eagle of Rome spreads its wings wide, and you can hear the tramp of legions echoing along the Nile's banks. Dust clouds rise as armored soldiers march in formation, their standards casting shadows over villages that once bowed only to pharaohs. Egypt is no longer its own master. The grandeur of pyramids and temples remains, but beneath them lies a new reality. Foreign governors, Roman taxes, and an empire that treats the Nile as another jewel in its crown. A mainstream fact. After Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, Egypt was absorbed directly into the Roman Empire, not as a typical province, but as the personal possession of Augustus. This meant senators were barred from entering without permission. Egypt was too valuable, with its grain shipments feeding the people of Rome. For the first time in millennia, the title of pharaoh no longer carried true sovereignty. Instead, emperors in faraway Rome styled themselves as heirs to Egypt's divine kingship. Here's your quirky tidbit. Roman officials sometimes adopted Egyptian religious customs to win favor, but they weren't always convincing. One Roman prefect tried to lead a sacred Nile festival, tripped, and fell into the river mid-ceremony. Locals joked that maybe the gods weren't too impressed with their new overlords. Imagine your new boss showing up to work, fumbling the coffee machine, and declaring themselves an expert. Except the coffee machine is a sacred river. Historians still argue whether Roman rule was a crushing blow to Egypt's culture or a continuation under new management. Some point out that temples remained active. Hieroglyphs continued to be carved, and Egyptian identity persisted for centuries. Others insist that the loss of sovereignty marked the true death of pharaonic civilization. As you stand by the Nile, you watch ships laden with grain bound for Rome, and the river still flows. The people still pray, but the throne of Horus now sits empty. Egypt has become a chapter in someone else's empire. Its once thunderous voice reduced to a whisper beneath the Roman eagle. The clang of Roman armor fades, and what rises in its place is the whisper of prayers in languages both old and new. Egypt, long a land of gods with animal heads and afterlife spells carved into stone, begins to shift under the weight of changing faiths. You walk into a temple of Isis, its incense still strong. But beyond the walls you hear murmurs of different hymns, Greek chants, Roman rituals, and eventually, faint echoes of Christianity taking root in quiet corners. A mainstream fact. Under Roman rule, Egyptian religion didn't vanish overnight. Temples to Isis, Horus, and Osiris remained active well into the 1st centuries CE, and Roman emperors often presented themselves in pharaonic garb to legitimize their authority. Yet gradually, older traditions waned. By the 4th century CE, Christianity spread through Egypt, and pagan temples were closed or repurposed, marking the end of millennia-old religious practices. Here's your quirky tidbit. The cult of Isis became so popular that it spread far beyond Egypt, reaching as far as Rome, Pompeii, and even London. Picture a Roman aristocrat in Britain making offerings to an Egyptian goddess, probably while bundled in a wool cloak to survive the damp cold. It's globalization, ancient style. Historians still argue whether this religious transformation was peaceful adaptation or forced suppression. Some see it as a gradual blending, where old gods lived on in new forms. Others view it as an abrupt severing. With temples violently shut and traditions erased, you pause before a crumbling statue of Horus, its falcon head chipped away, and you realize the truth lies somewhere in between. The gods of the Nile never vanished completely. They linger in symbol, in whispers, in the stones themselves. But their power to bind society together had dissolved, leaving Egypt spiritually fragmented. The divine chorus that once thundered across the desert is now a faint echo, drowned out by the hymns of new faiths. The chants to Isis and whispers of Christianity dissolve into a harsher sound, the low rumble of discontent. You wander into a village square where people mutter angrily about tax collectors, their voices edged with hunger and frustration. Egypt under foreign rule isn't just losing its gods, it's losing its economic stability. The Nile still flows, but its bounty feels like it belongs to someone else, siphoned away to Rome, to Constantinople, or to whichever empire currently holds the keys to Egypt's granaries. A mainstream fact. Heavy taxation became a hallmark of later Egyptian life under Roman and Byzantine rule. Grain shipments to feed Rome's population took precedence, leaving Egyptian peasants to struggle with shortages. Corruption in local administration only made matters worse. As officials skimmed from collections and forced communities deeper into poverty, this wasn't just paperwork, it was survival. And for many Egyptians, the system felt rigged against them. Here's your quirky tidbit. Papyri records preserve actual letters from angry taxpayers complaining about corruption. One villager bluntly accused an official of stealing the goat meant for my taxes. Imagine writing a formal complaint to your governor that basically says, "Hey, your guy stole my goat." Bureaucracy never changes. Historians still argue whether this economic strain directly fueled Egypt's unrest, or if the resentment was more about the loss of sovereignty. Was it the crushing taxes, the corrupt officials, or the fading belief that their rulers were divinely chosen? Probably all of the above. You watch as farmers, weary from toil, glare at armored guards escorting scribes who tally up their grain. The anger is quiet now, simmering beneath the surface, but you sense it could ignite at any moment. A reminder that even the mightiest empire rests on fragile human trust. And when that trust breaks, no monument, however grand, can hold society together. The angry murmurs of peasants clutching their grain fade, replaced by the restless sigh of the Nile itself. You watch the river's surface ripple in the moonlight and realize that Egypt's fate has always been bound to this watery lifeline. When the Nile flowed generously, fields turned green, bellies filled, and temples thrived. But when its rhythm faltered, famine shadowed the land. Tonight, the water level looks low. The banks cracked and dusty. The gods once praised for balance now seem silent. A mainstream fact. The Nile's floods vary dramatically over the centuries. In some eras, climate changes altered rainfall in Ethiopia, the source of the Blue Nile, leading to years of drought or irregular flooding in Egypt. Such fluctuations meant fewer harvests, shrinking surpluses, and desperate populations. Inscriptions record famines so severe that whole villages were abandoned, while priests scrambled to interpret the gods' supposed displeasure. Here's your quirky tidbit. Egyptians sometimes blamed hungry Nile crocodiles for the river's failures, weaving tales that the beasts had swallowed sacred offerings meant to encourage the flood. Imagine pointing at a giant reptile and saying, "That guy's the reason our wheat didn't grow." Not exactly scientific hydrology, but it reveals how myth and survival mingled in people's minds. Historians still argue whether these environmental challenges were decisive in Egypt's decline, or just one factor among many. Was it droughts and weak floods that broke the backbone of Egyptian society? Or did political mismanagement turn natural challenges into catastrophes? You run your hand along the cracked mud, feeling the fragility of an empire that once seemed eternal. The Nile still flows, but its song has changed. Instead of the steady drumbeat of abundance, it whispers uncertainty. And when a civilization is built on a river's grace, uncertainty is the most dangerous flood of all. The cracked mud on the Nile's banks crumbles beneath your feet, and as you move further, you notice something more haunting than the river's silence. Silence in the libraries and temples themselves. Once, knowledge flowed as freely as the Nile, carved into walls, inked onto papyrus, recited in chants by priests. But now, that wisdom begins to fragment, to scatter, to vanish. You wander into a scriptorium where scribes once copied hymns and scientific texts, and the benches are empty, the lamps cold. The very memory of Egypt feels like it's slipping through your fingers. A mainstream fact: the famed Library of Alexandria, built under the Ptolemies, was one of the greatest repositories of ancient knowledge. Though the details of its destruction are debated, Egypt's intellectual heart suffered blow after blow: fires, neglect, and political upheavals. Alongside this, temple schools that once preserved sacred and practical knowledge slowly fell silent as new rulers and religions shifted priorities. Medicine, astronomy, and theology, once Egypt's proudest achievements, faded into fragments scattered across parchment and stone. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some surviving papyri reveal magical recipes mixing real medicine with spells, like treating headaches with herbs while chanting, "Get out, demon, you who breaks the skull." Imagine going to the doctor and getting both aspirin and a free exorcism chant thrown in. Not exactly clinical, but strangely comforting. Historians still argue whether Egypt's cultural decline was inevitable under foreign rule, or if deliberate suppression of old traditions accelerated the decay. Were priests and scribes simply outcompeted by Greek and Roman scholars? Or did conquest actively silence them? You trail your fingers over faint hieroglyphs, chipped and fading, and feel an ache deeper than hunger or thirst. It is the ache of forgetting. A civilization built on words, stories, and cosmic order now finds its voice muted. And you realize, losing battles and kings is one thing, but losing memory, losing the very knowledge of who you were, that is the truest fall of all. The faint etchings of fading hieroglyphs trail behind you, and the air thickens with the sound of foreign tongues. Egypt, once the ruler of its own destiny, is now ruled by others. Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, each layering their own authority over the land of the Nile. You walk through a governor's palace where Greek columns rise beside Egyptian motifs, where statues of pharaohs wear crowns carved by foreign hands. The throne still exists, but the one who sits upon it is no longer a pharaoh chosen by Ra. He is a puppet of empires, a mainstream fact. By the first millennium BCE, Egypt had endured repeated conquests. Persians ruled it as a satrapy. Macedonians under Alexander transformed it into a Hellenistic kingdom, and Romans claimed it as imperial property. Local rulers were often installed as client kings, but their authority was limited. They bowed to distant masters who controlled their armies and their wealth, and Egypt's sovereignty became an illusion, maintained through ceremony but hollow at its core. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some puppet rulers still took their role as pharaoh seriously, commissioning temples and even attempting to style themselves in traditional regalia. One Ptolemaic king tried to lead a religious festival, but got the sacred chants so wrong that priests reportedly had to correct him mid-ceremony. Imagine your karaoke performance being so off-key. The DJ hands you the lyrics sheet. Not exactly divine authority. Historians still argue whether these puppet governments were tolerated by Egyptians as a pragmatic necessity or resented as betrayals of tradition. Did ordinary people truly care who sat on the throne as long as the Nile still flooded and the bread still baked? Or did the loss of authentic pharaohs sap Egypt's spirit over generations? You feel the unease in the marketplace. Greek merchants bartering, Roman officials counting taxes, Egyptian farmers bowing out of habit more than reverence. The pharaoh's throne is still there, but it's only a stage prop now, and the play of power belongs to others. The faint echoes of puppet kings trail into silence, and you find yourself staring at the last flickers of pharaonic rule. The once mighty throne, once gilded with divine authority, now sits in shadow. Egypt has seen centuries of grandeur, decline, conquest, and adaptation. But here, the pharaohs themselves fade for good. Their crowns, red and white, Symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt lie dusty in forgotten storerooms, relics rather than instruments of power. A mainstream fact: the final Egyptian dynasty, the 31st, ended in 343 BCE when Nectanebo II fled before Persian forces. Though later rulers like the Ptolemies and even Roman emperors claimed the title of pharaoh, Nectanebo is often regarded as the last native ruler of Egypt. After him, Egypt would never again be ruled by one of its own sons or daughters in the old tradition. The Age of Pharaohs, stretching back 3 millennia, ended not with a dramatic explosion but with a slow exhale. Here's a quirky tidbit. Nectanebo II later became a figure of legend, even sneaking into Greek stories. Some myths claimed he fled to Macedonia and fathered none other than Alexander the Great. Imagine history's greatest conqueror secretly being billed as half Egyptian royalty in a bizarre crossover episode. Historians roll their eyes, but the tale shows how deeply Egypt's mystique captivated outsiders. Historians still argue whether we should call Cleopatra VII the last pharaoh or reserve that title for Nectanebo II. Was pharaonic rule defined by bloodline, tradition, or simply the ability to wear the crown? The debate lingers. Much like the statues half buried in sand, you walk among them, broken faces of kings, toppled obelisks, half-legible hieroglyphs, and realize the fall of the pharaohs wasn't a single moment, but 1,000 cuts across centuries. Their gods, armies, and monuments once made Egypt eternal, but eternity itself proved fragile. What remains are ruins whispering of glory, loss, and the unstoppable tide of change. The statues in the sand blur into twilight, and now the world grows quieter, as if the desert itself is taking a deep breath. The fall of the pharaohs has come and gone, but their presence lingers everywhere, etched in stone, whispered in myths, carved into the very imagination of humanity. You walk past ruins bathed in the last golden rays of the sun. The Nile reflects the colors like liquid fire, but instead of roaring with power, it seems to sigh. A mainstream fact: even after Egypt became a Roman province, its legacy lived on in the symbols of power. Roman emperors styled themselves as successors of the pharaohs, and later, Christian and Islamic rulers built atop Egypt's foundations. The civilization was gone, but its influence was immortal. The hieroglyphs would eventually fall silent, their meaning forgotten until the Rosetta Stone unlocked them centuries later. Even silence could not erase Egypt entirely. Here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval travelers often believed the pyramids were giant granaries built by Joseph of the Bible. Imagine arriving in Giza, gazing up at the Great Pyramid, and thinking, yep, just a really oversized pantry? Wrong. But it shows how Egypt's monuments always sparked imagination, even when misunderstood. Historians still argue what Egypt's greatest legacy truly is. Was it the architectural genius of the pyramids, the political innovation of divine kingship, or the cultural endurance of myths like Isis and Osiris that shaped religions far beyond the Nile? Each answer feels true, and yet incomplete. As you stand in the cooling sand, you realize the legacy isn't just one thing. It's the way Egypt still makes us wonder. The wind softens. The desert cools. The voices of gods and kings fade into whispers. Not gone but drifting, always there if you listen closely. The fall of the pharaohs was not the end. It was a transformation, scattering fragments of their world into ours, where they still shimmer, half buried, waiting for us to notice. Now, as the last torchlight flickers against the temple walls of memory, you let the weight of this journey ease from your shoulders. The sands shift softly, like a great blanket pulling over a tired civilization, and the Nile hums gently. Steady now, no longer crashing with the urgency of history. You've walked through centuries of triumph and loss, from golden crowns to cracked mud underfoot, and the echoes of those who lived here seem to sigh with relief that their story has been told once more. Your breath slows, as if matching the rhythm of the river. The towering pharaohs, once overwhelming in their power, shrink into silhouettes against the stars. Their voices, once commands carved into stone, now murmur like bedtime stories drifting in from another room. Every monument, every broken tablet, every faded hieroglyph becomes less a demand for remembrance and more a lullaby, reminding you that even greatness must eventually rest. The desert night stretches wide, cool and serene, and you feel yourself drifting with it. The whispers of gods and queens soften into nothing more than the gentle rustle of palm leaves. The Nile, steady and eternal, becomes less a mighty force and more a quiet companion, guiding you gently towards sleep. You've traveled through the rise and fall of pharaohs, through invasions and rituals, through grandeur and collapse, and now, as the stars shine over an endless desert sky, you can let go of the noise. The struggle, the endless march of history, all that's left is calm. All that's left is silence. All that's left is rest. So close your eyes. Let the sands cover the noise. Let the Nile carry you. The story has ended. You are safe. You are still. You are home.